Now obviously people on YouTube have covered this story I'm going to go through today, but to be honest I don't care, it needs to be brought up as much as possible forever. These sorts of things cannot be allowed to fall out of our minds under the barrage of news, doom and gloom that we get literally every day. It is the reason we have 24-hour news coverage, because it can hide a story as quick as it can break one. More so in 2020 I would say, because day in day out the powers that be sling untold amounts of fecal matter that they call facts at us. But obviously this story is not surprising to me in the slightest. It is infuriating all the same, because it just adds to the cover-up that was our petition earlier this year, that will now be released as a paper written by so-called experts based on the report. So in other words, a complete cover-up, while Marcus Rashford screams about free school meals and how this government doesn't care about the young, but they are always silent on this issue. This is a serious problem. People with real public profiles ignore the actual issues faced by many young girls in the UK, while people like me are left to call it out, but even with over 100,000 subscribers, it does very little to bring attention to it. That shit, as I said, really pisses me off. If these real so-called public figures with large followings called this out, not only to stop the gangs this story is about, but from degenerate fuckpigs in general, the powers that be might actually do something. I say might because it's never a guarantee with these people, let's be honest, they are politicians after all. But a few words on it from someone like Marcus Rashford, and it's much harder for them to ignore it, like they have with this story here from the Mail that headlines: National Child Abuse Inquiry refused to probe Rotherham and Rochdale sex grooming scandals over fears of looking racist. Why does this not surprise me in the slightest, and essentially goes back to the police and councils covering it up for exactly the same fears. The National Inquiry into Child Abuse was scared of being called racist and refused to investigate some of Britain's most notorious sex grooming scandals, it has been revealed. Key witnesses were also barred from giving evidence victims and experts in the inquiry have claimed, amid accusations of cowardly reluctance to examine mass offending in Rotherham and Rochdale, much like the police and that, as I said, did at the time. In those towns, they say, was a pattern of group crimes in which men of Pakistani heritage were overrepresented, and the reluctance stemmed from not wanting to face accusations of being racist, the Times reported. Because obviously, in this soy-infused, pussyfooting world that we live in now, everything has to be based around whether or not you can be accused of racism. Who actually gives a fuck? If you're not racist, then it really doesn't fucking matter, does it? It goes on, Sammy Woodhouse, a victim in Rotherham, claimed the heads of the inquiry have not placed survivors at the forefront of their investigations and are selective in what they decide to look at according to newspapers, which let me tell you is most likely 100% correct, never mind according to newspapers. It goes on, if you are going to get to the root of gang-related child sexual exploitation, you need to go right to the heart of it, she added. They are trying to bury what happened in places like Rotherham and Rochdale because they're scared of being called racist. Sarah Chapman, Rotherham's campaigning MP, and Nazir Afal, a former chief Crown prosecutor who brought justice to the Rochdale sex grooming gangs, are among those appalled by the inquiry's failure to hear evidence. Well, let me tell you now, the entire country, if they knew about this, would be appalled by the fact that they're not hearing evidence. Actually, I'll rephrase that. Corbynistas and those on the left probably wouldn't, but the rest of the country certainly will. A former Manchester police officer who exposed the alleged cover-up of sex grooming crimes in the region accused the National Inquiry of being too frightened to open the hornet's nest. Well, maybe you should get some working class guys in there to open the hornet's nest, because I'm sure they wouldn't mind doing it. And if you put them in there, I expect they will do a proper job. Because I know if it was me, I wouldn't stop until I had uncovered absolutely everything. It goes on, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse began in 2015 and has so far cost £143 million. So with that amount of money spent, it should be all-encompassing, let me tell you now. It is trying to establish why there was an institutional failure to protect children from abuse. Well, I'm sure there are many theories as to why that is, and I have my own, but I won't go into it here because it will take too long to lay it out. In its investigation into the exploitation of children by organised network, the inquiry has looked at the Church of England, the Roman Catholic Church, investigating many of the worst-known scandals involving such organisations. The organised network's arm on the inquiry was also expected to examine the most infamous cases of group grooming and exploitation. Big trials over the past 10 years have exposed a previously hidden crime model involving the targeting and sexual abuse of teenage girls by groups of men, largely of South Asian origin. No, largely of Pakistani origin, get that right. Groups in Rotherham, Rochdale, Oxford, Leicester, High Wycombe, Dewsbury, Peterborough, Halifax, Newcastle upon Tyne, Telford and Burnley have been prosecuted since 2011 for sex grooming. From late September, they held 2 weeks of public hearings for this organised network's investigation, with the final day for closing submissions set to take place on October 29th, so yesterday. However, it decided not to hear evidence from survivors or those with knowledge of the crime pattern, and instead chose to select 6 areas of England and Wales: St Helens, Tower Hamlets in East London, Swansea, Durham, Bristol and Warwickshire, the best way to cover up what had gone on elsewhere, obviously. The reason given was that these areas represent a range of sizes, demographics and institutional practices, but none of the 6 areas has witnessed a major prosecution of South Asian sex grooming gangs. Pakistani grooming gangs, stop calling them that. Furthermore, the Times reports that the 2011 national census found the proportion of the population that is of Pakistani origin is lower than the national average, so that suggests why they chose those areas, directly avoiding that, it would seem. Henrietta Hill QC, who is the lead counsel of the inquiry, told the hearing on its first day that after the inquiry carefully considered the extent to which, if at all, it should focus on areas such as Rochdale, Rotherham and Oxford, the IICSA decided it would be more appropriate to focus on different areas because it's easier to cover it up that way. The IICA is investigating claims against local authorities, religious organisations, the armed forces, public and private institutions and people in the public eye, but not the grooming gangs who are apparently raping 19,000 girls a year, the dirty fuckpigs. Can you actually believe this bollocks? Now, to me, this shows once again that these so-called commissions and inquiries into these things just do as bad a job as the police and council did at the time. They are failing the victims of this abuse and any future victims that may come of it through their inaction. They actually make me sick. But I would say that article perfectly shows how they are trying to cover this up by purposely avoiding areas that have grooming gang problems or the ones that have at least been caught, because I expect it's happening in many places that we just don't know about yet. Personally, I think the heads of the inquiry should be forced to pay back the £143 million they have wasted on this report that has avoided some key things that we needed to hear about. How can they get away with just wasting our money like that?
There is a pattern consistent throughout history of oppressed people turning on the oppressors, slaves against their owners, the peasantry against the feudal barons, colonies, Mr. Verhofstadt, against their empires. And that is why Britain is leaving. And it doesn't matter which language you use, we are going, and we are glad to be going. We're off.